Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth presentation in this year's Databricks lecture series. I'm really glad you could join us. I'm Drew Pollan. I'm the Principal Academic Director of MIDS here at the iSchool, and I'm pleased to introduce Zeashan Pappa, who's here today to speak with us about data governance and Lakehouse architecture and how Databricks' Unity Catalog provides a governance layer for data lakehouses. Zeashan Pappa is a technology executive and architect who has 20 plus years of enterprise software architecture, engineering, consulting, and project management expertise. Zeashan is currently the product specialist for Databricks Unity Catalog and leads go-to-market strategy, customer and field adoption related to Unity Catalog, and internal data governance SME teams at Databricks. So welcome, Zeashan. Thanks so much for joining us today. Before we get started, though, I just want to let everybody here know that we're going to set aside 10 minutes or so at the end of the presentation for questions. So feel free to pose questions in the Q&A panel or the chat, and Zeashan can address them after the presentation. So thanks, Zeashan, again. Should we get started?
Yes, let's definitely get started. Thanks, Drew. All right, so I appreciate you guys making the time for me to come and speak today. As Drew mentioned, I work at Databricks. I'm the go-to-market leader for Unity Catalog. I'm also the new product integration leader for Unity Catalog. I'm also the SME leader for data governance. So it's a lot of different things all over the place. Been around this industry for about 20 years and done everything from very hardcore hands-on development to solution architecture, enterprise architecture. I've got 4 kids and I'm always on the phone, is what it seems like. So I work for Databricks. Databricks is the data and AI company. You guys are probably very familiar with Databricks to a large degree. Inventor and pioneers of the data lakehouse, recognized for a whole bunch of amazing things, including our OSS contributions to things like Delta Lake, Apache Spark, and MLflow. We've got over 7,000 customers from Fortune 500 to straight up unicorns in our customer portfolio. We've got 3,000 employees and we're growing. So if you guys are interested, you can certainly check out our careers website afterward. So I'm here to talk a little bit about data governance and this product that we have called Unity Catalog, which is seeking to solve this in a number of different ways. But I kind of want to talk a little bit about what data governance is, sort of in a really fundamental way. And I look at data governance as a simple boilerplate statement. It is something that tells us how to use data as an organization, right? So there's kind of 2 ways of looking at this, right? There's a top-down view, which is what your CEO or CIO, CDO might prescribe down, right? And these are in terms that we think about strategy, standards, quality, or policy, right? So risk management or controls. How do we define our stance with privacy? How do we make our data available or usable? What type of integrity does our data have or have to have? How do we measure that? And then from a policy perspective, like, how are we securing it? How are we ensuring that we are compliant or achieving compliance against regulation or regulatory requirements? And then how do we audit that or deal with audits if audits come up? And that's a really top-down view. And a lot of times, especially if you're coming right out of school, you may not have to deal with the top-down view necessarily directly. You might actually be looking at the bottom-up view, right? Which is I like to put it in 3 different classifications. The first being people, like who owns it, who defines it, and that means who owns the data, who owns the data governance, who defines the data, who defines the data governance. The process, which is what or who is applying it, what is the workflow or the mechanism by which you would adopt any particular principles of data governance, who maintains it, who audits it. And then lastly, but not least, right, the technology. I mean, largely for most organizations for a very long period of time, data governance is mostly people and process, right? And technology was always, hey, I've got this ability to restrict some data or restrict access to some data in my database or whatever my data platform of choice is, and I'll go and apply it. And maybe in an on-premise world without the cloud and without zettabytes of data, like this was like tenable, right? But when you start to think about applying it in the cloud and applying it across different types of data platforms, across different types of ecosystems and landscapes, it gets really challenging to think about that common metadata layer, knowing where all your data is, having all of the ability to identify people correctly, like they're authenticate people correctly or authorize them correctly, and then also kind of putting all that information back together into like a cohesive audit, so that you as an enterprise consumer, as an enterprise chief data officer, or a person that's responsible for compliance and audit at your firm can really understand what it is and how it is data is being used in your organization. So that's data governance, I think, from a really high level perspective. And there's a lot of models for how data governance works, right? I like to think of it in really simple terms, and I try to explain this in really simple terms. You can get very complicated with how this looks and how this works, but If you think about it four ways, right? You've got people that produce data, you've got people that consume data, you've got people that are managing the entitlement of data or managing some standards of compliance. And then you've got teams that are enabling those people to do their jobs, right? Those are the operations teams. So I call those producers, consumers, governors, and then operations. And these might work in different forms and in different spheres within any large organization. In a small organization, you tend to see these things as centralized. Sometimes they're the same person, right? Or same group of people, right? They might be doing all of the above, all playing all the roles of all these teams. But as you start to get into really large organizations, right, you'll see different patterns. Like some of these things will be distributed. You'll have different teams that own producing different sets of data. You'll have different folks that are responsible, data stewards that are responsible for managing compliance or quality or entitlement of data, right? So this starts to get very complicated, and you have a lot of different permutations, right, for governance models, for distributed and centralized approaches, right, at most enterprises. And if you think about that, and you think about my comment earlier, right, the people and process has largely been the 80% for data governance for the majority of time. And we're starting to get into this new frontier where the technical aspects of what data governance looks like with any given data governance layer in any particular product or platform space is starting to take up a bigger chunk. If you look at Gartner and hype reports and things like that, you'll see data governance is right up there at the top. It's pretty exciting stuff. As exciting as boring enterprise things can be, but that said, it's a comment that I think resonates with almost every business leader that I've talked to. I talk with a lot of business leaders, from CIOs to CDOs, and at the end of the day, I don't think anybody disagrees with this statement. Right? Most enterprises today, in some way, shape, or form, the vast majority of organizations today struggle with data and AI governance, and there's a lot of reasons for that, right? So if you think about Databricks, and let's take Databricks as an example, right? And let's take most cloud native customers as an example, or cloud customers, or even customers that are moving to the cloud. Most of their data is landing in the data lake, and a lot of this data is unstructured. In fact, somewhere around 90 to 95% of this data in almost any organization is unstructured. But this is also your gold, right? This is where a lot of the value from things like artificial intelligence or machine learning models is sitting. And the reality is that subsets of this data, right, is copied over to your data warehouses and structured tables, and then back again in some cases, right? And this results in disjointed and duplicative data silos, and it's difficult to manage these across multiple systems and multiple systems of record. This gets worse, right, when you start to think about incompatible security and governance models between these two products. I mean, data lakes are really great at working with files, things like logs or text or images, videos, perhaps a Parquet table or a Delta table, some structured data, unstructured big data table, right? And then data warehouses are principally dealing with things like tables and views and the nature of, right? They offer that fine-grained control, but lakes are really coarse-grained at kind of this like file level or prefix level, like within a particular object store. And then when you start to stack this up on like different types of tools, you've got this weird situation where you run into incomplete support for different types of use cases, and it really becomes challenging to come up with a cohesive data governance strategy when you start to look at this, and keep in mind like the usage of data lakes and the proliferation of customers storing data in the cloud. Like it's only getting bigger and bigger and more year over year. So this is a problem that has been developing and brewing for quite a while, right? And the other thing that's important to understand here is that fundamentally, right, if you think about data lakes as a product, governance is just fundamentally hard to enforce on these data lakes, right? There is no such thing as fine-grained access controls on a data lake, right? There is no common metadata layer, which means if there's no metadata, I can't find my data. I can't go and run a query and say, find me all tables or all rows that meet this particular set of criteria. This means that finding data and discovering data is a very time-consuming process, right? This translates into a whole bunch of other things like audits, for example, like understanding who read what, who modified what, so on and so forth. This is very challenging. It's very cloud-specific if it exists. And the same thing goes for governance models. Like if I want to say that Drew should not access this set of files, right? I have this challenge, right? Where doing it in one cloud is very different than doing it in another cloud. There is no agnostic model for governance that exists in cloud. And that's weird. It's awful, right? It's terrible, right? And this gets worse when you start to think about different types of assets, right? So like, I mentioned logs and text and images and videos and tables and all these fancy things, right? Like models, machine learning models, dashboards, other types of discrete artifacts that like live within this concept of a lakehouse or a data lake, right? There's no way to provide consistent governance across these assets. So this becomes like a real problem, and there's not really like a, there was for a long time at least, there hasn't really been a very clean and like obvious solution. So as you can see, like this in general, this path is it's a path fraught with challenges. There's obstacles at almost every turn, right? So as we were kind of building out our Lakehouse vision for Unity Catalog, we had a fundamental, I wouldn't call it epiphany, but I would call it a fundamental like belief that this was a problem that we needed to solve, and we needed to solve it once and for all. And this is where Unity Catalog comes in, right? This is the fundamental governance layer for the Lakehouse platform. It's kind of the missing piece of the Lakehouse platform. It provides this unified stance on governance across clouds for all types of workloads, helps your organization be compliance and audit ready. It also works like in a performant manner to meet enterprise scale, and it can kind of be seamlessly integrated into your product stack, right? Because it's a very API first product, like most of the products at Databricks. So I'm gonna pause for a second. I know I've got a few of you on the phone. If any of you would like to ask a question, and I can pause my monologue for a moment so you can ask a question. All right, cool. Drew, anything from the attendees that they would like to ask at this point?
Not yet. So anybody want to ask a question, you can do so in the Q&A panel or in the chat, and we will make sure that Zeashan gets to it.
Okay. Well, so let's talk a little bit about some of the key capabilities that enable some of those benefits that I was talking about. So I mentioned like in my comment and talk earlier, right? Good data governance, right, comes from understanding your data. It comes from understanding who your users are, right? So within the Databricks platform, we had this disjointed view that I'll explain a little bit. It's monolithic view for metadata and user management that was not, it was monolithic and it was distributed, right? So it was not centralized in any way, shape, or form. So it was a bit challenging to use and to write effective governance against that. So we've centralized that. So we've centralized the metadata layer. We've centralized the user management layer now within the Databricks product. We've centralized also data access controls. We've added some really cool functionality in a product called Data Lineage, right, which basically gives you the ability to understand, given a particular data asset that you might build, like a table or something. If I take that and I use that table to create another table, I'd like to understand that there's a relationship that existed between those two tables, and that gets larger and larger as you start to create derivative assets out of other assets, right? And perhaps multiple derivatives out of single assets and so on and so forth. So being able to draw that in a graph and understand that in a graph form, right, is really useful for things like impact analysis. Like, for example, if a particular piece of data was bad, how far and how wide is this impact of this one particular piece of data? If you're trying to do responsible AI type compliance use cases, right, this kind of tooling, right, is really valuable. And I'll talk about that as we go forward. Also the ability to do access auditing, the ability to do search and discovery, and then I'll talk briefly about some secure data sharing with Delta sharing as well. So let's talk a little bit first about centralized metadata and user management. So prior to Unity Catalog, like every Databricks workspace, right? And Databricks workspace is nothing more than effectively like an exposed set of interfaces you can log in, and you can create notebooks, and you can launch endpoints and clusters, and kind of do everything from one place. And a workspace used to be this logical point of segregation for a bunch of different things with Databricks. And what we started to realize is that a lot of our customers ended up creating a lot of workspaces, right? They wouldn't have just one workspace. Some customers would have hundreds of workspaces. And it made sense because they were treating, what they were doing is they were treating workspaces as the segregation point for data. They were treating workspaces as the segregation point for users. Perhaps it was as a business unit. Perhaps it was like an application team. Perhaps it was just one person at one side of the company, one person on the other side of the company. And a lot of times they would end up with these different workspaces. And this is interesting, right? But it told us a lot about how our customers are actually using our product, right? So the workspaces at this point, they had user managements, like the ability to define users and groups as kind of this component in the workspace. They had this concept of a metastore, like a Hive metastore, as a component in the workspace, and they had access controls as a component in the workspace. Now these three things, right? part of what I mentioned earlier, right? The user management, the metastore, the access controls. This being in the workspace makes the workspace very monolithic, right? And this is a challenge, right? Because the data was not centralized. So if that organization had multiple Databricks workspaces, they'd define users in one place and in another place. They'd define the metastore in one place and in another place. They'd define access controls in one place and somewhere else. And this was just challenging, right? It was hard. Customers had to duplicate things. They had to do things many different ways, and perhaps we didn't see this coming. But like, you know, a lot of the usage of workspaces as they kind of evolved over time, it told us a lot about how our customers wanted to use their data. So we retooled that, and now with Unity Catalog, all of those components, user management, the concept of the metastore, access controls, they're all kind of in this orthogonal plane that runs across all workspaces. So no matter how many workspaces you create for your organization, there's one Unity Catalog, and you can use one metastore should you desire. You have one universe of users. You have one truth of a system of record when it comes to things like access controls. And this is like fundamental, right, to having an organizational-wide, consistent data governance strategy, right, is having this common metadata layer, this common access control layer, this common understanding of who your users are and who your people are. And so stepping forward from that and getting into some more cool product bits, right? Because we broke down that data silo, like the one that I mentioned earlier of you know, each workspace having their own individual metastore, because we're breaking down that silo, we kind of had to add an additional namespace into the product to give our customers the ability to still access and still segregate data in ways that were meaningful to them, right? So we added this concept called a catalog, right? So catalog, if you're familiar with it probably from RDBMSs or other data platforms, right, gives us that 3 levels of namespacing, so we can do catalogs.databases.tables or .views, right? And this gives us that, again, that additional level of namespacing, which you could use for anything from representing SDLC life cycles, like, you know, dev, test, prod, or representing perhaps business units like sales or engineering, what have you, or perhaps some combination of the two. It also allows our legacy Databricks customers to be able to access the high metastore that was in and a fundamental part of the metadata layer for the old workspaces prior to Unity Catalog. So it also gives them the ability to access that through a convention-based name, Hive metastore. So this is a pretty cool addition to Unity Catalog, and I think it definitely makes it seamless to be able to access the existing metastores, as well as give your customers or, you know, your users, right, a really cool new way to organize their catalogs and their layouts of what their information architecture looks like. All right, so I mentioned centralized metastore. What I also want to include in that is centralized access controls. So if you're ever moonlit as a database admin, right, you would realize that ANSI SQL DCL is probably the most popular way to grant access to data. We didn't necessarily want to reinvent that wheel. We wanted to leverage all of the existing knowledge and talent and folks out there that are very comfortable in working with these types of formats. So we chose to extend and build on ANSI SQL DCL. So ANSI SQL DCL is the data control language specification part of ANSI SQL. So it's the part of ANSI SQL that focuses on being able to grant access or revoke access or deny access to individuals or principals within any data platform, right? So in this case, it's a pretty simple syntax, right? You just grant a particular privilege, so it could be a select or read file or what have you, right, on a particular type of securable, like an object, right? And that's granted to a principal. A principal is a, you know, service user, a physical like user like you or me or a group, and just to be clear, like a securable could be a table. Securable could be a path in some cloud storage container. It could be eventually, right, in addition to those, it could be other objects like I mentioned, like dashboards and models and things like that. The cool thing about Unity Catalog is, and a divergence from how this used to work before, is you used to be able to have to do this through ANSI SQL. Like you have to run a query in a notebook or in a cell, and, you know, it would take effect as part of a job or as part of a running cluster notebook. With Unity Catalog, it's all this entire product lives in the control plane. So the control plane of Databricks is kind of the set of shared services that run and are available from you know, whatever region that your particular Databricks workspace is deployed in. So say I deploy a workspace in, I don't know, East US. of Azure, right? Which is one of the regions in the East US in the Eastern United States for Microsoft Azure. If I deploy a workspace in there and I say set up my Databricks workspace in that region, there's a whole bunch of control plane services that exist that Databricks maintains. And these control plane services are where Unity Catalog lives. So these shared services, right, give us the ability to be able to do all these cool things like use these user interfaces or use RESTful APIs to work with and set access controls. So this gets like really cool and really like impressive when you start to think about the ability and the power of this, right? Like you could have Git flow dictate what your data governance pipelines look like, right? So you can write data governance code, right, and have API driven, other systems or request response systems or fulfillment or request fulfillment systems, right, actually like apply grants for you, right? So there's all sorts of cool integrations that some of our customers have been coming up with based on this, right? So the ability to apply these access controls is something you can do via NC-SQL. It's something you can do via a user interface. It's also something you can do via RESTful API. So just want to drive that point home. Really cool feature. So Unity Catalog changes some fundamental things, and it's a bit weird, I think, but it's a bit of a leap for a lot of our customers. But once they take the lead, they really understand and they really start to like it. I'll start with this one level set, right? Unity Catalog becomes a data broker for your data. So in the previous world, with Databricks, your clusters and your endpoints, they would have an IAM role attached to it. They would have some cloud security component attached to it that would dictate how do I go and read data from my S3 bucket or my ADLS bucket, right? That would be a function of cloud identity. We take that away from the individual user and we broker that now through Unity Catalog. And I'll explain that in a follow-up slide when I talk about the request lifecycle through Unity Catalog. But before I get there, let me level set with a couple of concepts around what a managed data source and external location is. So Unity Catalog exposes something called a metastore, right? So a metastore, you're familiar with this concept with things like Hive, right? A metastore is a top-level container for a whole bunch of other things. Now, in Unity Catalog, a metastore is a lot more than it is in Hive. You can have multiple metastores, for example, in Unity Catalog, and within Unity Catalog, there's other types of primitive objects that can also be contained within a metastore. So Hive, it's typically just tables, catalogs, databases, etc. But with Unity Catalog, you've got your 3-level namespace objects that I mentioned. You've also got the ability to create objects called external locations and credentials. So an external location is nothing more than an object that dictates a particular cloud storage path. For example, I have a bucket, it's named XYZ, and in there I've got a folder named ABC. I could create an external location, XYZ, ABC, and I could tell Unity Catalog that whenever I access this external location, I want to use this particular IAM role or this particular set of credentials, right? And a storage credential is another first-class object that lives within Unity Catalog. So now the difference here, right, from the way things used to work is you would bring your identity with you when you wanted to use Databricks. Now, Databricks will keep your identity for you and will tell you when you can use it. It's a pretty big change, but to be honest with you, most of our customers have been pretty satisfied with it. So whenever you set up Unity Catalog, you will set up a metastore, a default metastore that will be assigned to whatever workspaces that you're configuring. With this metastore comes a managed data source, right? That managed data source is nothing more than a container or a bucket, something, right, in your cloud that will be the default landing zone for all of your data. So for example, if you were to create a table with Unity Catalog and you didn't specify a location for that table, this like table that you create, it would by default go into this managed data source. That is by definition what would be called a managed table, right? And it would live in a managed data source. You have the ability to do a lot more than that, right? You have the ability to create, as I mentioned, these external locations, right? Once you create an external location, say some other arbitrary path like an ADLS bucket or eventually a GCS bucket, you can then create an external table that is based on that and tie it to any point in your logical hierarchy. So now you can start to stitch together this really cool, really large, well-structured hierarchy that is Unity Catalog. In addition to that, you'll also have the ability to provide governance on these files in cloud storage, right? So whether you're creating external tables or managed tables, right, you'll have the ability to provide ACLs on these entities, as well as ACLs down to files in cloud storage. Right now, we are offering the ability to do it kind of in a directory-based way. But we'll eventually get to quite a bit more level of feature functionality as we build that out. Before I continue on to the next slide, I would like to pause again and see if there's any more questions or any questions. Cool. Okay. So let's talk a little about the life of a query with Unity Catalog. So as I mentioned, prior to Unity Catalog, your cluster, your SQL endpoint was sort of where you would bring your cloud identity to. You'd either have an IAM role, if this was AWS, configured on that cluster, and that would dictate how you go and read data from an S3 bucket. You'd have a service principal or some pass-through identity configured. And some of these things would basically be enough to tell Spark and the executors within your cluster or your endpoints how to go and read data from the cloud. That's the short answer of how things used to work before. So how they work now is a little bit differently, right? So if I, as a user, I send a query, and again, this can be any query. Like, so Databricks Unity Catalog works across all of our language types. So that's SQL, Python, R, and Scala. I send this query to a cluster or a SQL endpoint. What ends up happening is that cluster endpoint will actually go, and for every object that's contained within my query, it'll go and hit the Unity Catalog control plane service. It'll check the namespace and the metadata and the grants of that object and kind of evaluate whether or not I, as a user, or based on my group membership, have access to be able to do the operations that I'm trying to perform. It'll evaluate that internally, and pass or fail, it'll write it out to an audit log. And assuming it's a pass, it will assume the IAM role or service principal for each underlying table. So say if I queried two tables, right? One was a managed table, one was an external table. These have two different sets of credentials. It would assume both those credentials, and it would go out to that cloud storage device, whether it's S3 or ADLS, and it would sign those URLs for us. Now, when I say sign, both S3 and ADLS offer feature functionality within their platforms as this GCS, right? To allow a well-known named user the ability to sign a URL for another user, right? So this is called downscoping or URL signing. In the case of ADLS, there's a particular term called SAS tokens. In the case of S3, there's actually like 3 different ways to do it. The downscope roles and pre-signed URLs, and then STS tokens. So there's three different pathways, right? That could be used for doing an S3, and one common pathway with ADLS. Either way, what Unity Catalog does is, based on whatever data files you're trying to read, it'll go and it'll create these downscope URLs that will grant that back to the cluster. So the cluster now can go and grab that data directly. Now, if you look at step 5, right, it's important to note Unity Catalog is actually not in the path of your data, right? It will get you access. It will authorize you and give your cluster, your endpoint, the URLs, presuming that you have the correct access credentials to be able to the correct ACLs to be able to access that data. But your cluster, your endpoint, will actually go directly to that storage device and grab it, right? So this entire process, steps 2, 3, and 4, right? This is happening between nodes in your customer VNet or your Databricks workspace and our control plane services, right? So this is a very quick operation, right? We're talking milliseconds. And eventually that's actually going to get even faster as we start to build out and offload query planning into Unity Catalog. Long story short, clusters and SQL endpoints, right, would then request and ingest that data from those URLs. They'll get it back. They'll do any last mile enforcement of policy and then send that data back out to the user. This is the big fundamental change that is Unity Catalog. And this is the thing that most customers, when they see it, they're like, my jaw is dropping. This is great. I no longer have to rely on the clunky permissions model of ADLS, or the difficult to use, difficult to scale permissions model of IAM and S3. So they love that. They love the ability that now because all of this is being pushed to Unity Catalog, the ability for us to get very fine grained with our access control really starts to step up and become very, very prominent and possible. So Unity Catalog is the lever to kind of open some of these possibilities. One of the other interesting, cool, and amazing parts of Unity Catalog is what's called built-in data lineage, right? So this is end-to-end visibility in terms of how data flows and is consumed within your organization. So let's take an example, right? And I think I used this example earlier. I create a data set, and then I want to create a derivative of that data set, and perhaps use that derivative somewhere else and somewhere else, and so on and so forth, right? And perhaps 20 derivatives later, I find out that hey, one of my source tables is bad. How do I know all of the tables that are impacted along this entire chain, right? I'd have to go back, and as if I was a data engineer, I'd have to go back and figure out exactly which jobs ran, and go do a bunch of code analysis to figure out exactly which tables and data sets were used. And that's really challenging, right? And as you start to think about really large organizations that sometimes are doing this, building derivatives of data in depthful graphs of hundreds and thousands, right? it's almost untenable, right? And our product is solving this in a kind of a very cool and unique way, in that we auto capture the lineage every time you run commands on Databricks clusters and SQL endpoints, and we track that lineage down to the table and the column level. So it's interesting, but like, how does that actually work, right? So every time you run a job or a query or a DLT job, right, what ends up happening? Anything in Spark, pretty much, right? Anytime you submit any query, whether it's a Spark.read or a select star from some well-known table, right, it translates into some set of Spark operations, right? And those Spark operations, those actions and transformations, right, make up something called a logical plan. And that logical plan is an object that has an enormous amount of metadata that's associated with it. So every time you run something, right, that logical plan is generated. So then all of that metadata for that logical plan is uploaded to something called a lineage service, right? And the lineage service is a control plane service, again, lives within the Databricks control plane. And what this is doing is it's going to take and kind of collate all of the metadata for various logical plans together and look for patterns, right? It's going to look for this particular piece of data that was queried from this table, right, was used over here. And it'll be able to kind of basically create a very large usage graph and walk that graph, right, using some very fun graph traversal algorithms to get down to be able to build out a definitive set of table and column level lineage. And that's what is ultimately used in our user interfaces, as well as pumped out to APIs to work with external catalog partners. The other thing that is new and cool in Unity Catalog is called data discovery, right? So this is primarily, we call it data discovery, but it's really a data search feature, right? It's a search feature to search for assets that are stored within Unity Catalog. This is really cool because if you think about any data platform, any data platform product, the first thing you do when you open it up, right, is you look for data. Like, what data can I query? What data can I use? And within the Databricks platform, this fundamentally was probably not the best experience for like a number of years. And it would get worse depending on, and it would get worse and it would get very more disjointed, right, depending on what workspace you're in. Like if you have one of 50 different workspaces that you were using, right, this being able to search for data across different workspaces sometimes meant having to log into different workspaces. So this wasn't a pretty fun experience, but now it is, and now it works in a consistent way across workspaces. It leverages a common permission model from Unity Catalog. So for example, if you don't have access to read or see some data, it won't even show up in your search results, right? And I think that from the perspective of being able to control access information for a lot of organizations, it's really powerful. If you think about that dual mandate, right, of being able to democratize your data as well as restrict access when necessary. So data discovery is sort of a fundamental part of that the data democratization piece. All right, so I'm going to pause again and end my monologuing for a moment and see if any of you have any more questions or any questions at all.
I've got a question. During your slides on data lineage, it really reminded me that data governance and trust that members of an organization have in data and what it produces, that linkage is there. So I guess I'm wondering, what do you think the important talking points or key indicators that you try to convey to members of an organization in order to underline or increase confidence and trust in the data and the governance strategy that you put in place?
So typically when we have this conversation with customers, I'll put this in a humorous way. It's mostly like bringing fire to cavemen. So this has been a very difficult and, like I mentioned, very challenging way to solve a problem to solve at scale for most enterprises. If they were doing it, through a collection of tools, if they were doing it in a very manual fashion, or they were hobbling tools together. Perhaps they wrote their own products. I mean, I have a number of customers that effectively wrote their own Unity catalogs, like some large digital native customers. And there's short answer. They're very happy with what they see because we've taken an ownership stance in terms of being the data platform, right? Actually owning the governance layer, right? It was something that we didn't really firmly do before. So I think that just kind of participating in that conversation alone has definitely made and given our customers a significant degree of confidence. If that answers your question. I realize it's a bit of a roundabout.
No, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, cool. So I will flip forward to the next slide and talk a little bit about delta sharing. So delta sharing is a really cool product, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about it. So before I get into it, right? Because of the crowd, I'll talk a little bit about why delta sharing is actually really important, right? So if we think about information as a whole, right? Companies are spending vast amounts of money, vast amounts of money, investing that into data platform infrastructure, investing into data storage costs, right? Investing into ingress and egress costs to be able to make to pull data in and make sense of it. And the whole purpose of this is to derive and drive value, right? And sometimes the value is intrinsic, right? Sometimes the value is realized through other means. But for the cases where the value is intrinsic, or perhaps where it's maybe it's not intrinsic to you, but it could be intrinsic to somebody else, there are a number of different business patterns that are starting to evolve, where customers and enterprises will sell data to other enterprises, right? And that's a very simplistic case. There are other types of patterns that are evolving, where customers or enterprises will bring their data sets to other enterprises for enrichment, and then take that data back. And then the other patterns further, which are evolving, where multiple enterprises will bring their data together and collaborate on it in an open environment. That's called a clean room, right? So data clean rooms are I think they're an old concept that is getting sort of rebranded. With big data, it's certainly a lot more challenging and a lot more, I would say, a lot more capable also. I mean, the capabilities of today's modern data platforms, right, in terms of enabling things like clean rooms, is a lot better than it used to be. But a clean room, right, is this if you think about it, it's this really cool way to, for example, I'm a cell phone provider, or a cell phone company, like a carrier. And I have a bunch of foot traffic data about my customers, and I want to bring that foot traffic data and give it to, I don't know, let's say a hedge fund, and that hedge fund wants to go and derive some analysis and perform some impact analysis based on every point of interest location, and determine whether or not the stores or the businesses that those particular points of interest are doing well, right? And kind of get some ancillary data, right, for their trading strategy. So there's lots of possible use cases, right? Ad tech companies have been doing this for years, right? Like, they want to understand more about their customers. They'll bring one set of personal information data, or PII data, and another set of PII data from a different source, and they'll combine them, right? There's a lot of potential use cases that come out of this, and delta sharing is kind of the mechanism to expose this and make it possible, right? Because it provides this protocol. And this protocol is actually very similar to what I described with the request lifecycle, the token vending lifecycle for Unity Catalog, but it provides this with non-Databricks platforms, right? So non-Databricks recipients, right? So this could be a lot of different types of use cases, right? So I know I mentioned the business use cases, like the clean rooms and marketplaces and things like that, but this it also works with different types of tools, right? Power BI, Spark, Pandas, Tableau, Java, Golang, right? All sorts of stuff, right? It works across all clouds, and effectively gives you the ability to share data at a partition level to almost anything and anywhere, right? And to do it in a very secure way, right? And it's a fundamental part of Unity Catalog, and a very cool product that we are building out and expanding on. And we have a lot of strategic initiatives around delta sharing, so it's pretty cool. So what's coming up next with Unity Catalog? I think I mentioned search. That's out now. It's pretty cool. It's pretty amazing. We have an upgrade wizard. So a lot of our customers, especially our legacy customers, customers that have been around for a while, they've been using their Hive metastore pretty profusely. They've got a lot of entities in there. They have these different metastores across different workspaces. They needed a path to make the transition to using Unity Catalog a little bit easier, right? So we developed this really cool upgrade wizard that is coming out, I think available now actually, that lets customers take their existing Hive metastores and one-click upgrade them to Unity Catalog. We're also working on our plays with partners, right? Our integrations with enterprise data catalog partners. So this is some of the big partners like Azure Purview or Amazon Lake Formation, AWS Lake Formation, guys like Calibra or Alation, right? All of these guys that are in this kind of enterprise data catalog or reference data catalog space, integrating that with Unity Catalog is kind of like our long story, long tail approach in terms of how we're going to fit into the larger ecosystem of products that's out there. And we're also working specifically on governance and sharing of machine learning models, and very exclusively on attribute-based access controls as well. And attribute-based access controls would give you the way or the ability to define tags or attributes on data and users, and then write policies grants, right, based on those the inclusion or the exclusion of those tags and attributes. So cool. I'm going to stop here. This is typically where I end my slides. So thank you guys. I'll keep the floor open for questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Zeashan.
Drew and Thea. Yeah.
Yeah, we have some time left, so we can address any questions that folks have. Please do type in chat, or you can raise your hand and I can enable your mic so you can ask a question. In the meantime, I have a question. I know cybersecurity is certainly top of mind recently. I'm wondering, how does data governance and Unity Catalog, how does that fit into your client's cybersecurity strategy?
Yeah, so I'll put it to you this way, right? Most breaches that occur, I think like something like 90% of breaches that occur are through rogue operators or side channel attacks, right? Where somebody had access to data that they probably shouldn't have had access to, and they did something with it they probably weren't supposed to do, right? And that is the majority of data leaks, right? And it's sad, but human error, right, is largely responsible, right? Not some glaring defect in code or some enormous exploit, right? It's typically not the case. So because data governance, if you think about what I was getting at earlier, right? Data governance is 80% process and people, and I would say 20% technology, right? I think the technology portion is growing, right? But overall, like products like this, approaches like this, mindsets, and adopting a mindset of achieving good data governance in your enterprise, right, I think is a fundamental part of having a good cybersecurity posture. Because if you have a good ontological understanding of all of the assets that are important to you as a company from the perspective of like data assets and things like that, and that they have intrinsic value or some extrinsic value, you'll learn to protect them, right? And you'll learn to make sure that folks are only the folks that are using it are the folks that are supposed to have access to it. And that's kind of the first line of defense for a good cybersecurity posture.
Thanks, Zeashan. Another question. What do you think the biggest obstacles for companies adopting Unity Catalog are? So what are the biggest obstacles? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I think the biggest obstacles for adopting Unity Catalog at this point are moving away from high metastores, right? And high metastores are ubiquitous. They have been around for ages, right? So from a technical perspective, that is like by and large the biggest obstacle from a technical perspective. Now, that said, right, we've got almost over 8,000 customers, right? And if you think about that number, a lot of these customers, some of these are Fortune 500, some of these are digital natives, some of these are smaller mid-market commercial companies. Some of these guys have never heard of data governance or have never applied a data governance strategy. And education and enablement, right, are kind of a hand-in-hand, like with are hand-in-hand levers, right, for us to be able to come up with an effective adoption strategy and help companies start to use this product at scale. So this goes a few different ways, right? There's an education track and making sure that guys like me are out talking to the community and really pushing good data governance and writing the right bits of technical material and non-technical material on how to achieve this and what the patterns and process are. And then also, improving the experience in our product so that upgrades and things like that, right, become like really, really seamless. I think those are that's kind of where I would draw it.
Great. So we do have, thinking of students in the MITS program, folks who are interested in taking on, roles in the industry that focus on data governance. And I'm wondering, what do you think are important skills or, knowledge sets for these folks who are interested in taking on data governance roles?
Yeah, so I think I'll speak to it from an experiential perspective rather than an academic perspective, even though I'm addressing an academic group. So from an experiential perspective, I think being in a role that a data governance role, right? There's a few different pathways, right? One is you are a technical expert or a data engineer or data scientist. You've been working with or involved with the production of data assets and data artifacts, right? it's a very common pathway to see yourself graduate or move into a role that is more governance focused or governance related. That's one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is almost everybody in an organization is involved with data governance in some way, right? Either they are recipients of data governance, or they're practitioners of data governance because perhaps they own a particular piece of data, or they work for a team that owns a particular piece of data, and by extension they're associated with it. So just to coalesce that statement, right? For example, you as a particular business owner, like let's say you own an application within a company, you're responsible for the data that comes out of the application. You might be what's called a data steward in a very common data ops pattern, right? And that data steward is responsible for managing the quality and the life cycle of those assets and making sure that the right people have access and the wrong people don't have access. So that is a way to interact with data governance in that sense as well. And then there are also folks that work and are aligned to chief data officer functions, right? And these are individuals who are information architects, essentially, and information architects, right, as a skill, right? These are guys that have, or women, or people that have experience with multiple different types of data platforms. They have experience in designing out what good data platforms look like. So it's multiple pathways, I would say, to get to understanding or get to a place of knowledge about what would make a good data governance career position. But there's definitely a lot of movement in the space. So it's definitely an exciting place to be.
Great, thank you. I know this is sort of along the same lines as a question you already answered, but how do you build the business case? You're trying to get an executive to buy in on starting or championing data governance initiatives at an organization. So, what are the sort of talking points, or what's the business case that you make in order to get that buy-in?
Yeah, so I think the business case is like typically whenever you're making a business case with any stakeholder, right? For most IT initiatives, whatever that IT initiative is, you're doing it on either the reduction of cost or the reduction of risk, right? For the most part, like there's usually two drivers, right? Unless you are providing some value generating product, right? When I say value generating, like something you can clearly articulate generates value, not like, hey, I generate these data assets and these data assets generate value. Unless you're providing a platform that does that, right? You're typically reducing risk or you're reducing cost, right? In the case of a well-run data governance product, you're reducing risk, right? So you can quantify that risk in many ways and shapes, and most of the time it's pretty easy math. Most CIOs don't bark twice when you throw them, hey, you know what? Like the compliance cost of the cost of a compliance failure if you leak PHI data, right, is $30 million, right, on average, right? Like, investing in this, right, it's a no-brainer. Investing the time and energy to build out your adoption pattern for Unity Catalog is a no-brainer. When you put it in terms like that, it's usually pretty easy. If you like I said, if you go and you look up data governance today and you look up information architecture and you see how far and wide some of these terms go, and the types of magazines that they and literature that they're circled in, right, you'll realize it's a buzz term, but it's a buzz term that has good meaning and good reason to be a buzz term. So hopefully that answers the question.
Absolutely. I think a lot of data scientists, most of the work in data science work is making sure that the data is ready to be used. And so I think there's a lot of questioning underlying assumptions about the data and identifying discrepancies or resolving discrepancies potentially in data sources. And so going back to some of the things you talked about in terms of Unity Catalog, what do you think the big strengths are in sort of that Unity Catalog offers in order to help data scientists with those challenges of questioning underlying assumptions and resolving discrepancies in data? Yeah,
so I think the first tool, right, in that arsenal, right, is the lineage tool that I mentioned earlier, right? The ability to understand, hey, this data set that I'm using, where did it come from, right? What is the genesis of this particular data source? How was it impacted or influenced along the way before it became to me as a curated asset, right? So being able to double click on that without having to go and talk to people, right? That's pretty valuable. In addition to that, right, good data governance, right, also implies good data quality, right, and that you are managing quality, right, in some in some as part of your governance process. This is not something right now with Unity Catalog as a product that we offer kind of explicitly, but it is offered through other parts of the Databricks product portfolio. For example, you can write what's called DLT expect statements, right? So you can write these expectations of what data is supposed to look like, and you can kind of bifurcate bad data in pipelines out to different landing locations where it can be retried or fixed or thrown out if necessary. So we do have that, and we do have the ability to surface metrics based on that. That will probably lean back into an overall quality profile summary type dashboard within the product in the future. We haven't really designed that out yet. But those quality, like storing all those quality results and storing snapshots of those quality of those profile results over time. Those are the types of features that you see in reference data catalogs. Strategically, right, we're leaning on our partners to provide a lot of that. It's possible that we'll pull some of that in, right, as necessary, right, where it makes sense to, from a perspective of being a data platform. We'll certainly pull some of that into our core product and then integrate it back out to these reference data products like guys like Purview or Calibra and whatnot.
Great, thank you. We have a couple minutes left if there's any other questions from others in the audience. Thank you so much, Zeashan, for sharing your thoughts and your experience with us. It was a great overview of Unity Catalog and of data governance. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I also want to thank Databricks for hosting the lecture series. Thanks to Tia Foss and to Rob Reed for organizing, and to Gary Morphy-Lum for Zoom support. And thanks for everyone joining us today. The recording of the presentation will be posted on the event page of the iSchool site in about 10 days or so. Thanks so much. Take care, everybody.